To make a perfect pie every time requires a knowledge of the scientific principles involved as well as a lot of practice. Good pastry is the hallmark to a good pie. The term pastry is used to identify a variety of baked products rich in fat, such as Danish pastries to pies. This unit deals with pies. Let's begin by understanding the difference between a single crust pie, a double crust pie, and a pie shell. We'll begin with a pie shell. It's one that is rolled out, placed in a pie tin, edges are fluted, and the crust is pricked with a fork and baked to be filled later. Poking holes in the dough with a fork is pricking it. This will prevent the dough from puffing during baking, but is only done to a pie shell pastry. A single crust is one that is just the bottom crust and that is placed in a pie tin, edges are fluted, filling is then baked within that shell. An example is a pecan pie or a pumpkin pie. A double crusted has a bottom crust filled with ingredients, then a top crust is placed on top, such as a apple pie. The main ideas of this section is that pies consist of a dough and a filling. Pie dough can be either mealy or flaky, and once a pie is prepared, they must be stored properly. Pastry is a stiff dough. Although the main ingredients are the same for bread dough, the proportions differ. Also, the final texture is different. Pastry is an unleavened and contains about half the water of bread dough. After baking, pastry has either a crumbly or a flaky texture. The aim is to produce 100 very tiny separate layers. When it comes to pie dough basic, it is referred to as the 3-2-1 dough. The ratio refers to the weight of the 3 parts. 3 parts flour, 2 parts fat, and 1 part liquid. Flour is what adds the structure, fat determines the tenderness, and the water is what holds it together. And of course we add salt, and the purpose of salt is to add flavor. Let's begin by going through the steps of how to create a pie crust. The method we use, they are very conventional, and they're such as a biscuit making method. Step 1 is to measure the flour and salt and sift together. Some recipes call for adding sugar for a sweeter taste. All-purpose flour is okay to use because it is comprised between a hard and a soft wheat flour. Salt tenderizes the gluten and enhances the flavor of the dough. So the only thing salt does is actually add flavor. Some doughs are also made with pastry flour. Step 2 is where we cut the fat into flour mixture until it resembles cornmeal. Fat makes pastry tender because it inhibits and holds back the development of gluten in the flour. Fat helps the flakiness because it makes those layers of gluten. Flour must be coated with fat to limit hydration before liquid is added. Solid shortening is cut in until the particles are the size of rice kernels or the texture of cornmeal. Liquid fats blend easily with fat to produce a short gluten strand. So when it comes to fats, you can use butter, margarine, shortening, oil, or lard. Those are all the types that can be used in pastry. The difference between them is the taste and flavor. Lard usually is more tender. Oil is harder to handle though and crumbly. Cutting and shortening with flour and salt is important to mix it thoroughly like coarse cornmeal to make the crust tender and flaky. Step 3. Water is the most common liquid used in pastry, although milk and other liquids can be used. Liquids hydrate or moisten the flour so that sufficient gluten can be developed to form a cohesive dough. When the amount of water is increased, more gluten develops from the flour, protein, and the pastry is less tender than desired. Liquids also provide some steam to leaven or rise the gluten, which produces flakiness and puffiness. The temperature of water is important, as cold water helps to chill fast so it doesn't melt. When it comes to mixing, we sprinkle the amount of liquid and generally use a fork. Keep mixing and manipulating to a minimum. Manipulation of the dough is kept to a minimum after the water is added to avoid tough pastry. When we're rolling, re-rolling overdevelops the gluten and decreases the tenderness as well. Gather the dough with your fingers and press it into a ball, kneading very gently. The portions of flour, fat, and liquid and the level of manipulation influence the pastry's tenderness. So some facts to remember on pastry. Pastry becomes progressively less tender as the quantity of water or flour is increased. The portion needs to remain balanced. Too much water increases toughness by hydrating more gluten than needed. Additional flour incorporated during rolling of dough also contributes to the toughness, since water is already present in the dough, and the addition of more flour changes the proportion desired. Manipulation of dough is kept to a minimum after water is added to avoid tough pastry. Re-rolling pastry overdevelops the gluten and decreases the tenderness. The flour must be coated with fat to limit hydration before liquid is added. Solid shortening is cut in until the particles are the size of rice kernels or the texture of cornmeal. Liquid fat blends easily with flour to produce short gluten strands. When adding the water, the utensil you'll use is a fork. Handling the dough too much toughens the dough. If you're not ready to use your dough right away, you can shape it into a ball, wrap it, and refrigerate it. Dusting with flour and put on a lightly floured surface. When rolling dough, to help prevent it from sticking to a rolling pin or the countertop, you can use a pastry cloth and a stockinette on your rolling pin. Dusting the bench and rolling pin with flour. Be careful not to use too much flour because it makes the dough tough. Rolling out the dough, it should be about 1/8 of an inch thick. Thickness all over. That means the entire, as you roll it out, should only be 1/8 of an inch thick. You roll from the center to the edges in all directions. Check occasionally to make sure it isn't sticking to the surface. When you finish, it should be perfectly round. Always begin rolling from the center to the outer edge, lifting it up at the edge. Be sure to be at least 1 to 2 inches larger than the inverted pie plate. Here you can see an example of after it's rolled out and what I'm talking about, the 1 to 2 inches of the inverted pie plate. When it comes to panning the dough, fold it in half or roll carefully around a rolling pin to lift it without breaking, being careful not to stretch the dough. Press it into the side of the pie pan. Be sure there are no air bubbles between the pan and the dough. Now when it comes to a single pie crust, we're looking here at fluting the single pie crust. This is what gives it the nice finish. It's a manner of decorating the edge of the pie. You fold under the extra dough extended beyond the edge of the pan and bring it over the pie rim. Even the rim. Then press with your thumb together to make a diagonal ridge around the dough. Sealing or fluting a 2-pie crust, put the bottom crust into the pan. Do not trim. Place the cold filling into the pan, then place the top crust on top of the filling. using a small amount of water or egg wash, which is beaten egg, to moisten the edge of the bottom crust. And then seal the two crusts together, tucking the edge of the upper crust under the bottom of the other crust. Then flute the crust and apply egg wash to the top of the crust for a shiny crust. You also have the option of doing lattice work, which is a grid pattern or pie crust made with individual strips of crust. Sometimes pie shells need to be baked before filling in the shell. This is blind baking. It is done to pies with cooked filling or solid fillings that will not be baked in the pie. To blind bake after crust is in the pan and fluted. Dock is where you place the holes with a fork all over the bottom of the crust. This is what we were talking about pricking earlier. This basically prevents it from blistering and bubbling up. So let's recap mixing the dough. Sift the flour, add the salt, make sure liquid is ice cold in the liquid. Cut the fat into the flour with a pastry cutter. Never overmix the dough. Use only enough liquid to hold dough together. Wrap in plastic wrap and chill before rolling. Best overnight. Can be frozen and defrosted overnight. Scale the dough. Dust the bench and rolling pin with flour. Roll out the dough and pan the dough. Flakiness develops as a small to coarse particles of fat are coated with moistened flour, flattening into layers by the rolling pin, melted in the oven and absorbed by the adjacent dough to form hollow spaces between layers of baked dough. Too much to too little water in proportion to the fat decreases flakiness, which is promoted by the production of steam. As the expanded protein molecules are coagulated by the heat of the oven, the flaky structure becomes firm. Facts to remember: a uniform distribution of fat can yield flaky pastry. Firm fat that remains in layers when rolled yields a flakier pastry than a soft liquid fat. Liquid fat that is thoroughly and evenly distributed tends to decrease flakiness while increasing tenderness. Mealy resembles a coarse cornmeal. Fat is blended into the flour more completely than flaky dough. This requires less water or milk. Flour particles more highly coated with fat and will not absorb as much liquid. Thus it becomes soggy, and it would be good for a custard or a fruit pie. Now let's take a look at fruit pie fillings, cream pie fillings, custard fillings, soft pie fillings, and chiffon pies. The main idea here is that fillings for pies are sweet mixtures made of different ingredients. Cooked fruit fillings can be purchased or made on the premises. The cooked juice method of cooked fruit and juice method, the pie filling is cooked and cooled before putting into an unbaked shell, and then the pie is baked at 400 to 425 degrees until crust is evenly golden brown. Uncooked fruit will have a starch to thicken fruit juices. Put into an unbaked shell and baked at 400 to 425 until golden brown. Cooled and fruit juice will thicken. There's a variety of starches that are used to thicken pies. Remember to always add starch to sugar before adding liquid to avoid lumps. Cornstarch sets up the gel that allows the filling to hold its shape when sliced. Modified starch, which is a waxy maize, is a type of corn product used in fruit pies that will be frozen. It makes a clear, soft paste instead of or a gel. It doesn't bake down when frozen. We also have tapioca or flour starch that are less often used because they cloud the pie. And then you have a pre-gelatinized starch. It's pre-cooked, is good to use in fruit, does not need to be cooked before filling the pie shell. Cream pies, they're a flavored pastry cream thickened with eggs, custard. Cornstarch thickens the cream filling. Cooked on the range top, poured into a pre-baked pie shell, often topped with a meringue. This is sugar, which is stiffly beaten with egg whites piled on top and put in the oven to brown. Examples are like coconut cream pie or chocolate cream pie. Custards are fillings made with eggs poured into unbaked pie shells. When baked, the egg's protein firms the pie. The secret is not to overcook the filling. Always preheat your oven to 400 to 425 degrees Fahrenheit. Bake 10 minutes to set the crust, then reduce the oven temperature 325 to 350 degrees until the filling sets. Soft pies are similar to custard. They also have eggs to firm the pie when baking in unbaked pie shell. This is an example of this would be your pecan pie. Fond pies are either cooked fruit or cream filling. They're stabilized with gelatins that is added to the hot filling. When filling is cooled, meringue is folded into the filling. Then the filling is placed in the pre-baked pie shell and chill. When it comes to baking pies, always preheat your oven. For the first 10 minutes, pie should be baked at 400 to 425 degrees to help set the bottom crust so it doesn't soak up moisture of the filling and become soggy. And then you take the oven down to a degree of 325 to 350 and continue baking. You will oftentimes find that you will want to make a foil ring around the pie to keep the crust from burning. Now, how do we determine the doneness? Custard pies or soft pies, you gently shake. If no liquid shakes, it's done. Pies continue to cook after removed from the oven, so soft centers will firm up. You can test it with a knife inserted in the center. If it comes out clean, it's done. For fruit pies, you follow the guidelines and individual recipe formulas. Your crust should be golden brown. When it comes to storing and serving, you want to cool before cutting. To prevent bacterial growth, custard and cream pies must be refrigerated. Fruit pies can be kept at room temperature. Unbaked pie shells and unbaked fruit pies can be frozen for up to 2 months. Baked fruit pies do not freeze well.